men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, for everyone can see, but few can feel. The Prince, Chapter 18.
You're in a meeting, glass table, coffee going cold. Someone cuts you off mid-sentence. Another person laughs. Your jaw tightens, your chest locks up, your throat goes dry. The impulse shoots up like an electric shock. Respond, correct, defend. And that's exactly where you lose. Not because you were wrong, but because you accepted the invisible game. There's a silent trap in every social interaction. An unwritten code where the first person to justify himself quietly steps into the lower position. You think you're making a point. You're defending yourself. You think you're showing strength. You're exposing need, and need is weakness. Today, you're going to understand the psychology of silent fear through the cold lens of Niccolo Machiavelli. Not the cartoon version of Machiavelli, but the engineer of real power. You're about to see why silence isn't absence, it's threat. Why the one who talks too much is begging for control. And why most men have been trained to react. But there's a cost. If you apply what you're about to learn, some people will pull away. Others will feel uncomfortable around you. You'll stop being predictable, and you'll lose the addiction to being understood. The question is simple. Do you want to be understood or respected? We've all been in a room where we'd lost power without anyone raising their voice. The game was never about truth. It was about frame. There's always an invisible courtroom, a judge, a defendant, and the first one who over-explains has already pleaded guilty. Machiavelli knew power isn't about morality.
Power is perception. It's narrative control. It's strategic coldness.
You don't need to win arguments. You need to make people hesitate before putting you in one. If you've confused silence with weakness up until now, get ready. Because what you're about to learn isn't about peace. It's about installing fear without raising your voice. Take a breath. The reactive man dies here. From this moment on, the code begins. Machiavelli understood something most people never notice. Power rarely lives in the attack. It lives in how you manage your response. The average man believes strength means striking back immediately. He confuses speed with authority, confuses eloquence with superiority. But strategically, a fast reaction is almost always a defensive reflex. And every defense reveals that you felt threatened. The first withdrawal begins when you realize the urge to respond doesn't come from reason. It comes from fear.
Fear of looking weak, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing invisible status.
Your brain reads any challenge as a threat to social value. The amygdala fires off micro-alerts. Your body tightens. Your ego demands immediate repair, and you talk. You talk to restore balance. You talk to recover your image. You talk so you won't look affected. But the moment you speak to prove something, you've already given up ground. Machiavelli wasn't concerned with appearing fair. He was concerned with holding position. And position never belongs to the one who rushes. The first person to react accepts the rhythm set by the other person, accepts the agenda, accepts the frame, accepts the role of the one who has to explain himself. And over-explaining is always a sign of perceived fragility. The first withdrawal is counterintuitive. It requires you to sit with internal discomfort without trying to relieve it. Because most responses aren't strategic. They're painkillers. You respond to reduce tension, not to gain leverage. When you interrupt that pattern, something shifts in the invisible hierarchy. Initial silence isn't passivity. It's active observation. You're not backing down. You're assessing. And assessment is a power position. The one who evaluates decides. The one who reacts executes. Machiavelli taught that a wise ruler controls the timing of his actions. He never moves because he's provoked. He moves because it serves him. In social terms,
a sovereign man doesn't respond when pressured. He responds when he chooses to.
That difference may look subtle from the outside, but internally, it's massive. Most people live under constant micro-social pressure. Glances, tone shifts, small jabs, indirect questions, and they react to all of it. That creates a pattern, predictability, and predictability is vulnerability. If someone knows exactly how you'll react to criticism, they know exactly how to push you. The first withdrawal breaks that predictability. When you don't react on schedule, a perceptual crack forms. The other person loses their read on you, loses control of the flow, loses certainty. And uncertainty creates discomfort. Discomfort creates caution. Caution shifts power. Here's the Machiavellian engineering behind it. Fear doesn't come from direct attack. It comes from controlled unpredictability. Initial silence creates that unpredictability. But pay attention. Empty silence doesn't command respect. Tense silence does. The difference is intention. You're not quiet because you lack an argument. You're quiet because you don't see the need. That detail completely changes the social read. The reactive man talks to preserve his identity. The strategic man lets his stability preserve it for him. That requires ego control. The ego wants instant recognition, wants to correct distortions, wants to win every micro battle. Machiavelli knew small battles distract from real power. When you react to everything, you're trapped in surface disputes. The first withdrawal is radical selectivity. You let minor provocations pass, not out of weakness, out of calculation. You choose where to invest energy, and social energy is capital. First, notice the physical urge. Don't fight it. Observe it. Second, identify the emotion behind it. Is it fear, hurt pride, need for approval? Third, don't act until the emotion drops at least 30%. That small reduction already changes the quality of your response. Because now you're not speaking to defend yourself. You're speaking, if you choose to, by decision. Another practical move. Cut your average word count in half during conflict. If you used to take 10 sentences to explain something, use 4. If you used to justify in detail, offer only what's essential. Verbal economy communicates self-sufficiency. Excess explanation communicates a search for validation, and validation is dependence. Machiavelli didn't respect the dependent. He respected those who could tolerate isolation. Because anyone who can tolerate isolation can't be socially blackmailed. The first withdrawal is your first step toward that psychological independence. You stop fearing silence. Stop fearing misinterpretation. Stop fearing being seen as cold. Controlled coldness is strategic advantage. It's not about being insensitive. It's about not being controllable. Reflect. How many times have you over-explained something that didn't need it? How many times did you try to restore your image instead of holding your position? How many times did you walk away from an interaction feeling like you talked too much? and lost weight? That's reactivity. And reactivity is invisible submission. Write this internally, or literally if you want, as a commitment. I don't relieve tension with words. I manage it. Repeat it until it becomes default. Because the first withdrawal is more than a tactic. It's the death of an identity. The man who needs to be understood dies. The man who can be misunderstood and remain intact is born. That's the first code. The one who reacts has already lost. The one who can hold silence begins to rule. Machiavelli understood that power is never fought over just in the content. It's fought over in the frame. Most men walk into interactions thinking they're exchanging ideas. They're not. They're being evaluated. Every conversation has an invisible structure. Someone leads. Someone responds. Someone questions. Someone justifies. That structure sets the hierarchy before a single argument is even examined. The one who asks too many questions assumes implicit superiority. The one who answers too much steps into defense. That's the invisible courtroom. And almost everyone walks into it willingly. When someone questions your decision, your opinion, or your competence, your immediate impulse is to explain. The moment you explain, you accept the hidden premise, you need validation. Machiavelli would never accept that position. To him, a ruler does not justify himself to a subject. He decides, and lets the decision speak. Bring that into modern social dynamics. If you treat every provocation as a legitimate invitation to debate, you're granting the other person authority to judge you. A question is never neutral. It carries intention. It may look like curiosity. It may sound like a joke. It may feel like concern. But structurally, it's a positioning attempt. When you over-answer, you accept the other person's frame. You enter as the defendant. And the defendant is already at a disadvantage. Law, too, requires you to see the frame before the content. Don't answer immediately. Assess what's actually happening. Is it a genuine search for information or a test of your stability? Machiavelli knew men constantly test limits. Not always out of conscious malice, but out of competitive instinct. They want to know, how far can I push? Where's the resistance? What's the weak point? If you always respond, you reveal those points. If you maintain strategic silence, the attempt to judge you loses traction. There's a critical difference between dialogue and social interrogation. Dialogue is balanced exchange. Interrogation is asymmetry. If you find yourself explaining repeatedly while the other person only questions, you've been placed in the lower position. The correction isn't attacking back. It's refusing the structure. How? First, don't answer every question. Some deserve to be returned. With what intention are you asking? Why is that relevant? What exactly do you mean by that? When you return the question, you reposition the dynamic. The one who was judging now has to explain. And the one who explains exposes himself. That's the Machiavellian inversion. Second, reduce the depth of your justifications. If you made a decision, don't turn it into a thesis. Excess detail is approval-seeking disguised as clarity. Third, observe the pattern. Some people constantly create micro-courtrooms. They comment on others' decisions, question choices, test consistency.
Not because they need information, but because they need to feel superior.
If you step into that game every time, you reinforce the structure. The invisible courtroom only exists because you agree to be judged. Machiavelli would never let his power depend on constant approval. He understood authority comes from posture, not explanation. This is where frame comes in. Frame is the dominant lens of the interaction. Whoever controls the frame controls the momentary reality. If the frame is, you need to prove you're right, you've already lost. If the frame is, your position stands unless challenged effectively, you maintain sovereignty. Most men live trying to convince. Strategic men live by assuming. Assuming isn't arrogance, it's stability. When you stop accepting every provocation as valid, something shifts in others' behavior. They measure their words. They test less. They respect boundaries you never had to announce. Declared boundaries can be challenged. Silent boundaries are harder to cross. There's fear in uncertainty. If someone doesn't know how far they can push you, they tend to step back. That's the strategic function of initial unreadability. But be clear, refusing the courtroom doesn't mean never responding. It means choosing when to respond. Choosing is power. Law, too, kills the defendant mindset. You're not on trial 24/7. You don't owe emotional reports. You don't have to defend every choice. If someone demands an explanation about something that's clearly your prerogative, you can simply say, "It was the decision I believed was right." No extra detail, no long justification. Short, firm, final. The silence after that sentence is more powerful than any added argument. That's the second conscious use of silence as a weapon. You close the hearing, and when you close the hearing, you redefine the hierarchy. Ask yourself,
how often do you allow yourself to be socially interrogated? How often do you feel the need to prove yourself? How often do you launch into long explanations just to avoid judgment?
That's not humility, it's conditioning. Machiavelli knew people respect firmness more than arguments, not because firmness is more moral, but because it signals self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency creates subtle fear. Fear of not being able to manipulate. Fear of not being able to bend. Fear of not being able to test. The invisible courtroom only controls those who fear disapproval. When you stop fearing how you look in other people's eyes, you dismantle the court. And once the court collapses, the judgment loses its force. From here on, interactions stop being defensive arenas. They become territories you move through with stability. Law 2 establishes this. You are not the defendant. You are sovereign. The biggest mistake the average man makes is believing power lies in having the right answer. It doesn't. It lies in the ability to tolerate the void without rushing to fill it. Human beings are wired to seek closure. When there's tension, they want resolution. When there's doubt, they want reassurance. When there's silence, they want meaning. And when you don't provide that meaning, the other person's mind starts to short-circuit. Silence creates an invisible phenomenon, projection. Without a response from you, the other person starts talking to themselves. They replay what they said, rethink their tone, wonder if they went too far, question whether they overdid it. You did nothing, but they begin to destabilize. That's because the brain hates social gaps. Human interaction follows predictable patterns, stimulus and response. When the pattern breaks, the nervous system goes on alert. It's not explicit fear, it's cognitive tension. And prolonged cognitive tension turns into anxiety. Most people rely on your reaction to regulate themselves. They test, watch your response, adjust their behavior. But when you become opaque, they lose calibration. And when people lose calibration, they start making mistakes. They talk more than they should. Reveal intention. Expose insecurity. Strategic silence is a mirror. And very few people can handle seeing themselves without distraction. When you don't respond to a provocation, the other person has to sit with their own words echoing in the space. No validation, no confrontation, no closure. That creates a powerful psychological effect, involuntary self-confrontation. Most aren't built for that, because most people speak to control the environment, not to sustain their own message. When you don't react, you remove the invisible support that was holding up their performance, and the performance starts to shake. Here's the core truth. Fear doesn't come from what you do. It comes from what you could do and don't. Not acting creates open possibility. Open possibility is undefined threat. An undefined threat is more unsettling than direct attack. Attacks are concrete. They can be fought. Prolonged silence is abstract, and the abstract activates imagination. Imagination is always harsher than reality. That's the blade. You don't pressure. You don't accuse. You don't confront. You let the other person's mind do it for you. But this requires brutal discipline, because the void will bother you too. You'll feel the urge to relieve the tension, to normalize the mood, to show everything's fine. That impulse is fear of rejection, and as long as you fear rejection, your silence will be weak. Powerful silence doesn't apologize for existing. It takes up space. There's a difference between insecure silence and dominant silence. Insecure silence avoids eye contact. Dominant silence holds it. Insecure silence shrinks posture. Dominant silence stays aligned. Insecure silence wants the tension to end. Dominant silence lets the tension mature. When you learn to let tension mature, you control psychological rhythm. Rhythm is power. Whoever controls the rhythm decides when something ends, and whoever decides when it ends holds the higher position. Most people are afraid of looking cold, but controlled coldness is a strategic tool. It's not lack of emotion, it's conscious containment of emotion that completely changes how you're read socially. You stop being predictable, and predictability is the raw material of manipulation. If someone knows that a little pressure will get a reaction out of you, they have leverage. If they no longer know how you'll respond, that leverage disappears. And when leverage disappears, caution appears. Caution is a lighter form of fear. Not the fear of yelling, the fear of the unknown. This law isn't about never speaking. It's about speaking after silence has already shifted the field. Words delivered after built-up tension carry a different weight. They don't compete for space. They close space. But if you speak too soon, you destroy the effect. If you rush to fill the void, you teach people that all they have to do is wait a few seconds for you to fold. The blade only cuts if you hold it steady. Internal question: can you handle being misunderstood for a few seconds? Can you handle appearing indifferent? Can you handle the pause without justifying the pause? If you can't, you're still dependent on other people's emotional validation. And dependence is vulnerability. When you master the void, you start noticing something unsettling. People measure their words more carefully around you, not because you threatened them, but because you didn't react. The absence of reaction creates perceived risk, and perceived risk changes behavior. That's when silence stops being defense. and becomes a tool of psychological disruption. You don't need to win. You need the other person to doubt their own position. And constant doubt weakens any attempt at dominance. The blade of emptiness turns you into unstable territory for anyone trying to control you, and no one advances confidently into unstable territory. If this law made you uncomfortable, it's a sign you still want to be easily read. And men who are easy to read are easy to position. Now the question is simple. Do you want to stay predictable, or do you want to become unreadable? There's an identity that was built to keep you safe. It's polite, reasonable, avoids conflict, explains itself before being accused, softens its tone before being seen as harsh. That identity gets rewarded, but it's never feared, and what isn't feared is rarely respected in competitive environments. Domestic morality is the invisible code that teaches you to prioritize acceptance over position. It whispers, "Don't make people uncomfortable. Don't be too much. Don't push too hard. Don't shut someone down in an awkward way." Little by little, you start editing your own presence. You lower your tone, soften your firmness, blur your clarity, not out of obvious weakness, but out of fear of being misunderstood. Here's the brutal truth. As long as you need to be seen as good, you'll be controllable. All it takes is someone hinting that you are too harsh, too cold, too selfish, and you'll feel the urge to explain yourself. And every defensive explanation moves you down the hierarchy. Domestic morality creates men obsessed with looking right. Strategy creates men focused on holding power. Those two rarely align. You were conditioned to associate firmness with arrogance, silence with rudeness, boundaries with aggression. But boundaries aren't aggression, they're territorial architecture. When you avoid setting limits because you're afraid of looking bad, you allow subtle invasions. Invasions of your time, invasions of your energy, invasions of your authority, and every tolerated invasion shrinks your presence. The death of domestic morality doesn't mean becoming cruel. It means stopping the use of kindness as a social self-defense mechanism. There's a massive difference between being ethical by choice and being agreeable out of fear. The first is strength, the second is disguised submission. Domestic morality teaches that keeping the peace is the highest virtue. But in competitive spaces, constant peace usually means you're giving up ground. Managed conflict is healthy. Chronic avoidance is power erosion. Ask yourself, have you ever avoided confronting something just to prevent tension? Agreed with something you didn't believe just to avoid looking difficult? Softened a strategic opinion to stay likable? Each of those moments was a small retreat, and small retreats, stacked over time, create a diminished identity. A diminished identity never commands structural respect. Here's the break. You have to accept that some people will feel uncomfortable with your new posture. Some will say you've changed, that you're different, that you've gotten colder. They're not reacting to your coldness. They're reacting to losing access. Before, you were predictable. Now, you're selective. Before, you justified. Now, you decide. That creates friction, and friction is inevitable when someone stops bending. Machiavelli understood that being loved and feared at the same time is ideal. But if you must choose, stability lives in respectful fear, not violent fear, the fear of consequence. When your behavior makes it clear that you don't yield to emotional manipulation, don't accept imposed guilt, don't soften boundaries just to preserve someone else's comfort. Something shifts. You stop being domesticated. Domestic morality feeds on guilt. Guilt for disagreeing. Guilt for prioritizing yourself. Guilt for not explaining. But guilt is a control mechanism. Whoever can trigger your guilt can steer you. The death of that morality begins when you tolerate being misunderstood by those who depend on your flexibility. That's uncomfortable. Because part of your identity was built on approval. You took pride in being balanced, measured, the one who doesn't cause problems. But often that meant being the one who absorbs pressure. Law 4 demands brutal internal honesty. Do you want real respect or constant approval? The two rarely coexist at high levels. Structural respect requires clear boundaries, and clear boundaries don't ask for permission. When someone crosses a line and you correct it without emotional excess, just dry firmness, you're declaring territory. No drama, no yelling, no long explanations. That unsettles people who were used to your softness, and that unsettlement is necessary, because identity shifts always create friction. Killing domestic morality means accepting that you're not here to be comfortable. You're here to be solid. And solidity doesn't negotiate its existence. From this point forward, your silence changes nature. Before, it was fear of conflict. Now, it's strategic choice. Before, you stayed quiet to avoid tension. Now, you speak only when you decide. That difference may be invisible to many, but it's felt by all. You stop being the man who keeps peace at any cost. You become the man who holds position at any cost. And position, once consolidated, generates automatic respect, not instantly, but inevitably. Because men who can't be manipulated through guilt are hard to bend. And the world measures strength by how hard someone is to bend. If this law makes you uncomfortable, it means the old identity is still resisting. It still wants praise. But praise isn't power, and you're not here to be praised. You're here to become sovereign. Now it's no longer about technique. It's about consolidated identity.
After the withdrawal, after dismantling the courtroom, after mastering the void, after killing the need to be good.
There's one final transformation left, becoming unreadable. A predator doesn't announce movement, doesn't explain intention, doesn't hand over an emotional map. He observes, he calculates, he decides. Most people are far too transparent. You can tell when they're nervous, when they're trying to impress, when they're insecure, when they've been hit. They leak signals constantly. Micro expressions, shifts in tone, too many words, long justifications. That makes them predictable. And predictability is structural vulnerability. Predatory presence doesn't mean constant aggression. It means absolute economy. You say less than you think, reveal less than you know, show less than you feel, not out of repression, out of control. Control is the core of sovereignty. When you become unreadable, three things happen. People start measuring every move around you. Manipulation attempts decrease. Your silence gains symbolic weight. This happens because human beings fear what they can't anticipate. Anticipation creates a sense of safety. If someone can predict your reaction, they feel comfortable pushing you. If they can't, caution sets in, and caution turns into respect. Law 5 demands behavioral discipline. First principle, strategic unpredictability.
Don't respond in the same pattern every time. Don't validate in the same tone every time. don't react with the same intensity every time.
Break expectations. If they expect irritation, give neutrality. If they expect justification, give brevity. If they expect confrontation, give silence. The other person's brain starts recalibrating constantly, and constant recalibration drains energy while you remain steady. Second principle, radical verbal economy. Words are resources. The one who talks too much devalues his own presence. Cut unnecessary commentary. Eliminate preemptive explanations. Remove excess detail. When you speak less, every sentence gains density, and density creates authority. There's a simple phenomenon. The rarer the sound, the more attention it commands. If you talk all the time, your voice becomes background noise. If you speak sparingly, your voice becomes an event. Third principle, surgical speech after prolonged silence. Silence builds tension. When you finally choose to speak, use short sentences. No exaggerated emotion, no long justification, no need for approval, firm statements, closed decisions, precise observations. That combination creates disproportionate impact, because the other person's mind has already been working during the silence. Your words simply close the process. Predatory presence also involves energetic posture. You don't enter seeking attention. You enter assuming space. No exaggeration, no theatrics, no need for external validation. Your gaze doesn't drop. Your posture doesn't shrink. Your rhythm doesn't speed up under pressure. Steady rhythm signals internal stability. Internal stability signals strength. And quiet strength is more feared than loud force. But here's an important detail. Unreadability isn't chronic emotional coldness. It's selectivity. You don't become distant from everyone. You become inaccessible to manipulation that changes the entire game. Before, you were read and positioned. Now, you observe and position. Before, you reacted to stimuli. Now, you create stimuli. Before, you sought implicit approval. Now, you sustain explicit autonomy. That's the final transition, from reactive man to sovereign man. Predatory presence isn't about dominating others. It's about not being dominated. When you become hard to map emotionally, you become hard to control. And control is the real objective behind every social dynamic. Final question before we close. If someone tries to pressure you today, will you be predictable? Or will you be an unknown? The world doesn't fear the loud man. It fears the one who stays steady under pressure. From here on, your old identity doesn't fit. The man who reacted is dead. The man who needed to be good is dead. The man who accepted judgment is dead. What's born now is someone who doesn't rush, doesn't over-explain, doesn't bend just to ease someone else's discomfort. Someone who understands the code and plays above it. Now you understand. Silence was never weakness. Weakness was the need to react. Weakness was rushing to explain. Weakness was being afraid of being misunderstood. For years, you confused restraint with submission, confused politeness with position, confused acceptance with respect. And you paid the invisible price. You lost weight in conversations, lost ground in decisions, lost presence without even noticing. But something shifted. The first withdrawal killed the automatic impulse. The invisible courtroom stopped existing. The blade of emptiness taught you to tolerate tension. Domestic morality was exposed as conditioning, and predatory presence solidified your new internal structure. Now there's a clear difference between who you were and who you've become. Before, you needed to be understood. Now you can be misunderstood and remain intact. Before, You spoke to relieve discomfort. Now, you let discomfort work in your favor. Before, your identity depended on how others read you. Now, your identity sustains itself. That's internal sovereignty. And internal sovereignty creates an inevitable effect. People feel your presence before they hear your voice. You don't walk in to prove anything anymore. You walk in to occupy. There's no need to raise your tone, no need to win arguments, no need to convince everyone. The one who needs to convince is negotiating value. You don't negotiate value, you hold it. Some will say you've changed. You have. The reactive man is gone. The strategic man is here. The man who needed to please is gone. The man who holds position is here. The predictable man is gone. The unreadable man is here. And the world responds differently to unreadable men. Because what can't be easily read can't be easily dominated. From this point on, your silence isn't absence. It's a warning. You don't react. You assess. You don't over-explain. You decide. You don't chase respect. You command it through stability. Keep this as an internal decree. I don't relieve tension. I control it. That's the code. And the man who masters it doesn't need to raise his voice to be feared. He simply remains. Still. Unreadable. Sovereign.